So I thought really today I'm just going to give you a bit of a guided tour of the NVT results out of 2014 and a summary of the long-term analysis, as well as a few other bits and pieces of commentary about the barley industry more generally that may be of interest to you. So first I was just going to start off with a few comments on the market. Now obviously we're enjoying pretty strong feed barley prices coming out of harvest and a pretty solid malting premium above that as well. A couple of global factors that have changed in the run-up into harvest that have influenced some of that. Now, our feed barley exports traditionally are dominated by Saudi Arabia and Japan and smaller amounts to other countries. We've seen the emergence of fairly large-scale feed barley demand in China, and Australian feed barley is actually working into the feed ration against US corn for a number of different reasons. So that's one driver of putting some strength into the market. There's also been some challenges for some of our traditional export competitors, particularly in North America. So for those of you that were at the canola plenary this morning, you will have seen some numbers on the growth in area sown to canola in Canada, and a lot of that has come at the expense of barley. So their sort of nominal exportable surplus is nothing like what it used to be as competition against our crop. The area sown to barley in the US has also been in free fall, so quite a lot of the exportable surplus increasingly from Canada will be drifting south of the border into the US. So Australian barley, for a number of reasons, has got some pretty strong fundamental demand drivers, and no one can predict prices, but we'd like to think that barley production is going to continue to be well sought. I guess one other observation out of the last 12 months, probably for every year for the last 20 years we've seen major growth in Chinese beer production, just massive. It's been the #1 beer producing nation for quite some time now. And last year we actually saw that level off. So whether that is a one-year blip or whether they have actually reached their market requirement, we'll need to wait and see. But I don't really see that as an issue, because the other thing that's happened is we continue to have really strong growth in beer production across Southeast Asia, and China's leading malting companies are increasingly exporting across those markets as well. So that tends to be more higher value, genuine Malt 1 accredited type varieties rather than off-grade or cheaper options. So good strength in terms of demand. Our thanks to Viterra for supplying figures on the commercial deliveries to the Viterra system. They've done this for a number of years, and so we're able to build up the picture of variety adoption trends within the state. And last week they gave us the 2014-15 figures. I guess the changes that we see are largely on trend for how we've expected varieties to be moving over the last couple of years. Most notable is this increase in scope. So it's been growing strongly, but out of last harvest represented almost a quarter of the barley deliveries into the Viterra system. So now really scope has gone past that phase of being introduced to the market. It now has really established segregation and marketing opportunities going forward into this harvest. Certainly you wouldn't expect to be discounted against nominal Malt 1 prices. So that's good news in terms of marketing and pricing for that variety that's now a big part of our production base. A lot of that has come at the expense of bull oak, as you'd expect. And so bull oak, by contrast, is down around 8% of production, and coming into this harvest we'll start to see some limitations appearing in terms of segregation delivery opportunities for that variety. It will still have strong market demand in terms of pricing, but the delivery options obviously are always limited, and I guess we'll see scope coming in at the expense of bull oak in some of those regions. Commentary on other varieties. Obviously Hindmarsh is a pretty well established big part of the state's production, and no major trend there. Similarly Commander, the other big part of our production base, not particularly changing over the last 3 years. Fleet has been a dominant variety, but in this last year we've started to see its area contract, potentially some of that going to scope. and probably quite a few fleet growers switching over to Fathom, which made its first entrance into commercial scale production last year. I guess the other general trend is the dwindling down of the old, out-of-date varieties and an almost trivial amount declared to others. So really most of the state is growing up-to-date, pretty new varieties. Okay, on to last year's NVT. Like we saw in commercial production, there was generally early sowing opportunities across the state with the exception of the southeast, and so the NVT trial series was sown on average a little bit earlier than long-term average, with most of the trials sown in the second and third week of May. We had really only one example of incomplete foliar fungicide protection, and that was Maritime at Minnipa that had netform net blotch infection up to the flag leaf at flowering time. But outside of that, you really don't need to be thinking about disease impacts when you're considering the yield and grain size results from 214 NVT. The grain yield averages across the state were remarkably similar to what we saw in 213. So an average of 3.68, the year before it was 3.7. But there were some marked regional differences. So Upper EP obviously had a much better year than the last couple, and the southeast at the other end of the spectrum. The trials themselves range from just under a tonne per hectare average at Lameroo in the Mallee up to 5.6 at Turretfield. Obviously we all know how dry things got towards the end of the year, and there was significant grain size pressure in a number of the trials. Not really evident in screenings levels per se. They were moderate. It was more shown up in retention values, with quite a number of varieties failing to meet the 70% retention limit for Malt 1. So there is some useful data in the NVT results discriminating varieties in terms of how they perform with that tight finish. And although there were trials, quite a number of trials with very high yield potential, where we'd expect the later maturing varieties to perform well, the sort of Oxford, Capstan type group, but given the nature of the season, even at those locations, they were not really competitive with the leading early to mid-season varieties. They were still the guns even at that higher yield potential. Okay, so onto a snapshot of the grain yield from last year. My mistake, obvious cut and paste job, it's not the 213 data. Within your paper there's a more complete table of variety performance. Just for clarity, I've picked out the popular varieties in commerce and some of the leading new contenders. And out of last year there actually were not too many surprises. The varieties have performed pretty well in line with what we'd seen the previous couple of years. Fleet, while a strong performer across most regions, is clearly outclassed by Compass, and pretty reasonable transition for growers to be looking at Fathom. One of the observations we had back from last year, at the beginning of the year, some areas had mouse problems and establishment issues, and we had described Fathom as having a very good weed competition, heavy tillering sort of characteristics. Some of that's a little hard to really fully measure in plots, but certainly the feedback was it filled the canopy a lot better than some of the other plant architectures and was very good in that role. And I guess that's part of the difference of Fathom from some of the other varieties in terms of its plant architecture and growth behaviour. Among the established malting food varieties, obviously the early finish to the year, Hindmarsh had another very strong performance across all regions. Commander pretty much in line with expectation, but along with Fleet significantly down in the Mallee compared to what its longer term expectation would be. The other number I'll draw your attention to is Scope. Now we know its yields are largely in line with Bull Oak, but if you look at these numbers, I guess Upper EP and the Mallee, where the IMI technology is particularly interesting, we're talking about 20% grain yield off the pace from the leading alternatives out of last year's numbers. And on these sort of yield levels and current pricing, you could be delivering Compass at feed scope at malt, and scope's going to be costing you $100 a hectare. So I guess out of that, I'd question whether we've got 25% of the state sown to it. Is that really the right way or most cost-effective way to deploy that technology? Can do the sums. Or alternatively, the other way to look at it is the new next generation Emmy-tolerant varieties, which we expect could be on the market for $2.16 as a feed option, really does step into a good opportunity to replace scope. The other thing to bear in mind, with 25% of production, that's a lot of area sown to a CCN-susceptible barley variety. So don't forget about CCN in the mix. Compass and Latrobe, I probably don't have to speak to very much. The yield numbers out of last year, spectacular increases over the established varieties. We've had just released the long-term meta-analysis from the stats team, and again, I've just pulled out some of the varieties. Not very different to the numbers that we saw out of the overall analysis for last year or indeed the year before. Fathom with a strong and consistent advantage over Fleet, with the possible exception of the Mallee. Hindmarsh pretty strong in just about all environments. And I guess Latrobe, we've kind of used the language it's equivalent to or maybe slightly above Hindmarsh. When we go through this analysis, it really is pretty consistent, a 1% or maybe 2% advantage over Hindmarsh. So certainly no danger in going backwards with Latrobe. And of course, all of that data is available on the NVT website. That's a fairly sophisticated analysis, and I guess there's some interest in not necessarily just interrogating average values, but looking at behaviour of varieties across different site, season, location combinations. And in wheat, certainly there seem to be examples of where you can find particular adaptation of particular varieties. When I go through the barley data and just look at the top gun varieties, I don't really see many examples of that. It tends to be the fairly consistent, those average performances reflecting individual results, whether you look at very different environments or not. Just a quick look at some retention values from last year. We had a reminder of why Maritime's our long-term benchmark in terms of the best grain size and grain plumpness, but again, Compass, Schooner, Fathom, Bass really have consistently been up this end. Gardner, probably our bottom benchmark for what you can get away with even in better environments, and a few varieties that have actually managed to be below that. So some useful data to consider there. I'll just finish on a couple of comments on some contract varieties or specialist varieties. There are quite a few of these options now managed by different companies and agencies. None of these will compete with Latrobe or Compass for brute force yield or bulk commodity profitability. But with the right agronomy and given some price premiums, or more importantly, given what specs you can deliver Malt 1 barley against, these actually can be quite profitable options. But a couple of just headline comments for you to bear in mind. Considering Southern Star, timely harvest is absolutely essential to avoid sprouting risk. Admiral must be sown early or avoid any grain fill drought stress conditions. It's a very long season variety. Charger, yield competitive, but net form must be managed to make it work. Navigator has got some contract production hubs in the southeast and is a pretty handy plant type, but VS to leaf rust, so it needs to be controlled for that. So there's some interesting different options there, but they will need your expertise in terms of the right agronomy to get them over the line. And I'm right on time, so I'll hand over to Rob to move into wheat.
Thank you, Jason, and my brief today is to give you an update on wheat varieties and their performance last year. A lot of what Jason said in general terms can apply to wheat as well, but what I'm aiming to do today is cover issues like varietal adoption trends, similar to what Jason covered, new variety releases, varietal performance last year and the long term, some ideas on guiding variety choice. I want to make some comments on the new Durham variety and its performance, and then talk briefly about what's around the corner. Up front, I must acknowledge not only GRDC for funding NVT trials, but ACAS and the staff for allowing us to use the data in these presentations. All the data, of course, is in the online website. I also like to acknowledge Viterra and their staff for allowing us the adoption trend data, and Dr. Hugh Woolwork for providing with an insight into the disease guide, which hasn't been released just yet, but I've got a bit of a look-see at what things are doing, and also to our SARDI staff that are involved in the management of NVT trials across the state and in Victoria, and the farmers that they collaborate with. So just moving on from that, Jason's chart for adoption trends is similar to this one for wheat. Over a period from 2007 to 2014 inclusive, you can see just what's happening in terms of where the variety adoption rates are going. I guess the change in the last 12 months has really been in maize. And this blue area here represents maize starting in 2010 and just what it's climbed to in terms of percent of total receivables. It's now 55% of total receivables based on last year's receivables. That's up just over 10% from the previous year. So maize still climbing at a similar rate to what it was the previous year. That's largely, I think, at the expense of varieties like Wild Catcham have dropped back a little bit. Scout's dropped back a couple of percent. Down here we're seeing Gladius dropping back also quite significantly. Axe has dropped back, and so on. So each of those is contributing to the maize uptake, but I need to also point out that we have seen some adoption over the last 12 months of the new variety Cobra. Down here it's running at around 3% of deliveries last year. Emu Rock's in the mix now, and also Grenade. So there's a couple of new varieties there that are just starting to become adopted. So what's been released in the last 12 months to consider in terms of new wheats? And I need to mention probably Cosmic as being one of the most interesting in terms of its wide adaptation. Last year it was in NVT trials and performed extremely well. I'll show the data for that shortly, but this is an early maturing, mid to early flowering variety similar to Mace and Scout. It's released from intergrain and derived from quite a diverse parentage there, which obviously adds to diversify any risks that anyone might consider in growing varieties like Mace and Korak. It has Mace-like yields, as I'll show shortly, quite good for your leaf spot and powdery mildew. Test weights are relatively good. Screenings, probably a little bit on the high side, similar to Shield. Black Point, we haven't got an official rating yet on Black Point for it. Probably its weaknesses, though, are worth considering. It's moderately susceptible to all of the rusts. It's moderately susceptible to CCN and moderately susceptible to Septoria triticide blots. So it has got some weaknesses there, but all the same, it's a high yielder. Aurora here is a durum variety that was released last spring out of the local weight program. Mid-season flowering similar to Tamaroy and Kelka and other varieties that we well know. It has shown very good early vigour and weed competitiveness, and tomorrow Simon Goss will talk more about that and show data on that, but that's quite a useful attribute for a durum to have. Disease resistance-wise, it's very similar to other durums. It's got good resistance to the rusts, moderate susceptibility to CCN, and so on. The other useful attribute for Aurora, though, is in its screenings potential. And we have seen some durums released in the last few years that have given very high levels of screenings and sort of disillusioned a lot of growers. Fortunately, though, Aurora is curbing that trend, and it's regarded as low to moderate in terms of its screening potential, and I'll show data on that shortly. A couple of varieties which I really want to cover very quickly, more for the high rainfall areas, for the southeast of the state. They're feed wheats, red grain feed wheats, released from Seed Force Broadacre and AGF Seeds. I guess in the interest of time, I'll just highlight that while they do have some disease resistance, like stripe rust resistance is not bad, Adagio here is quite susceptible to stem rust, S to VS for stem rust, and that clearly is quite a concern, and you would need to manage that variety accordingly if you were considering it. Scenario is much better for stem rust, MS to S, but still that's not brilliant. And but these varieties are certainly going to be looked at by some growers in the high rainfall areas. Just quickly turning to the NVT trial results from last year, just generally, Jason mentioned that barley yielded very similar last year in NVT trials, the average yield to the previous year. In wheat, we saw 3.11 tonne per hectare average across 23 sites. That was about 10% below the previous year, so wheat didn't fare quite as well as barley. But in terms of grain quality, we were mildly or pleasantly surprised by what happened in terms of grain quality. Screenings were as low as the previous year, 2.4% relative to 2.3%. Test weights were very good. Protein was on par with the previous couple of years. So quality-wise, the trials were quite good. I might just mention that there were 5 frosted sites in total across the 28 that we run across South Australia, and that's unprecedented. We've never lost that many sites before, and it's quite disappointing for certainly all the staff involved not to see their great sites released. But 3 of them were in central and northeastern Eyre Peninsula, and 2 of them were in the northern Mallee. Last year, the top varieties are listed here. I've got a list of the top 5 varieties in each region, and you'll see that Cosmic, Korak, Trojan, Mace generally feature right across the board in terms of how they've performed in each of the regions. So that's just a quick snapshot. Of course, in terms of statewide averages, Trojan was the leading variety. It marginally were higher than Korak on a statewide average, and Mace and Cosmic and Mace were a couple of percent below those. Just, however, that was last year's results. We did see Mace a little less dominant on Upper Eyre Peninsula. You see it's not even in the list of top 5 varieties there. Also, it was down a little bit in the Mallee. Welcome any suggestions as to what might be contributing to this, but certainly there's thought that chilling effects would certainly be a contributing factor. Just turning quickly now to the long-term results, which are certainly what you should be looking at in terms of varietal choice. And the top 4 that I mentioned in the previous slide really have done well in the longer term, in 2010 to 2014 data as well. See Korak, Mace, Cosmic, Trojan basically feature in the long-term data as well. So Korak has been shown to be quite reliable across seasons. Mace, Emu Rock, probably more dominant in the lower rainfall zone. I'll show a bit more data on that shortly. And we're generally seeing Cosmic, Scout, Trojan and Cobra to be more dominant in the high rainfall or high yielding situations. I've taken this one step further and actually categorised all of the NVT trial results according to their yield potential or the yield of the site over a 5-year period, and put sites into different categories according to their yield, so less than 1 tonne yielding sites, 1 to 2 tonne yielding sites and so on. You can see that the number of sites in each of these categories varies, and certainly in the categories from 1 to 4 tonnes, there's quite a number of sites that fit into those categories, not as many at this lower and higher end of the scale. But the feature here to take note of is that Korak, irrespective of the yield of the site, tends to perform relatively similarly across that whole range of yield potentials. Cosmic, you can see there's generally a trend for it to improve its yield as it gets into the higher yielding sites. Mace, the opposite, tends to be a lot better at the lower yielding sites than perhaps at the higher yielding end of the spectrum. And Trojan, given that it's later maturing than all of the others, you would expect it to be a bit better at the higher yielding sites, and that's what you see there. That same exercise can be done for a whole range of varieties, and a lot of varieties here fit into the category of performing a lot better at the lower yielding end. This group of varieties, Cobra, Phantom, Scout, tend to perform more relatively better at the higher yielding end of the spectrum, and we've got Estoc, Wildcatcham and Yitby there that tend to be pretty consistent across a whole range of sites. I'm going to flick through the next couple of slides pretty quickly because most of the audience has probably seen me present this at field days and other places, but if you look at taking things like stripe rust and yellow leaf spot as the predominant issues that you might consider varietal choice based on, you can look at going down the path of having a stripe rust resistant variety with good yellow leaf spot resistance, or a stripe rust susceptible variety with yellow leaf spot susceptibility if you prefer to take the option of spraying. And varieties that fit within these different categories are listed here, and I guess the most notable you'll see here is that Mace and Korak really lead all other varieties in this less than 3 tonne scenario, and there's 48 observations have gone into this analysis, 48 observations over a 4-year period, and Mace and Korak lead. Mace, you can see no red comments beside it, has very few other negatives apart from its low stripe rust resistance, but Korak, you'll see a few negatives there, Cosmic, susceptible to leaf rust, and so on. If you take this scenario to the high yielding situation, and here we've got sites that have yielded greater than 4 tonnes per hectare in this chart. There's 42 observations across that period of time where sites have yielded more than 4 tonnes, and you can see this whole area here has changed dramatically, and now Trojan and Cosmic and Cobra are all up in that mix of high yielding varieties. And certainly from the perspective of a variety with reasonably good rust resistance, not so good for yellow leaf spot, Trojan is an option there, APW quality, which also needs to be considered. Just now moving on to Durham's, and the highlight here really is DBA Aurora, which was released last spring by the weight program I mentioned earlier. Its performance last year was probably more moderate compared to the longer term. Certainly last year we saw 802 yielding very well on Yorke Peninsula, when we saw Saintly yielding very well in the mid-north, and the figures for Aurora are significantly lower than that for last year. But you should really look at the long-term results here, where Aurora 9% on Yorke Peninsula, 8% above average in the mid-north, really quite comparable to Saintly, or better than Saintly in the mid-north. And as I said earlier, probably the main message with Aurora is its lower screenings, 3.2% on average across 4 years of trials, 24 observations, 3.2%, where you've got Yawa running at 6.6, and everyone knows the issues that growers have had with Yawa, 802, 4.2, and Tilbury 3.4. So certainly Aurora is a marked improvement in terms of screenings percentage, but we still have a way to go there, I believe. I just want to finish up with some comments on what's around the corner. And of course, I don't normally preempt things that are too far away from release, because there are always issues like the final quality being resolved, or other release decisions that seem to make them fall at the last hurdle. But just to give you an insight into what's coming through, the most immediate variety you might see will be an IMI-tolerant version of Axe, which AGT are currently waiting on a final classification for in the next month or so. So if that gets the classification they want, that could be released this year to growers. AGT, and that line has had 3 years of MVT trial results, so we've got some good data to show how it does perform. AGT have also got a Mace type, so derived largely from Mace, with improved yields over Mace and improved stripe rust resistance. So everyone will obviously prick their ears up at seeing that. This line is really only going into NVT trials for the first time this year, so we always like to see how these things perform over a couple of years, but there'll certainly be a lot of interest in that line. From the intergrain breeding program, there's an IMI-tolerant version of Volcatchum coming through, due to be released to growers probably 2017. That will be of interest because it will probably set the bar in terms of yield for IMI-tolerance lines. Given Volcatchum is a very high yielding line in South Australia, it'll probably it should out-yield all the other IMI-tolerant options that we've currently got. And finally, Intergrain have also got another high-yielding line with moderate disease resistance. It hasn't got high resistance to the rust, but this line both of these lines were in trials, NVT trials last year, and could be released within a year or two. Thank you, Richard.
Rob, well done, and Jason, well done. Though I normally worry about these guys getting done on time, but they're both excellent.